Final Fantasy is my favorite game series of all time. Several games in the series are in my top 10 games of all time. So it only made sense to me to go through all the main series games and tier list them and put where each of them stack up, in my opinion. Now, again, this is my opinion. I know it's going to differ from a lot of different people on here, but I am going to give a detailed reason as to why I have each spot where they're at. And I hope you enjoy. Leave your opinions down below. Let me know what you think. If you want to see more tier lists or more Final Fantasy content in general, comment down below. Tell me what you want to see, whether you agree or disagree. I want your feedback because I love talking about this stuff. Another thing to keep in mind is that this is actually a re-recording of a previous video I did of the same tier list. So if you've seen this before, sorry, it will be a lot of the same stuff, but with fixed audio, so you will be able to hear my reasonings for the second half of the video this time. I will go a little bit more into detail about some of the earlier entries though, so don't worry there. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. So, starting off by the way, this is going to be in order 1 all the way to 15. So starting with the first one, it is the classic. It's what started it all. Now, there isn't a whole lot to get into. You could start to see, at the time, games weren't super narrative heavy. This was one of those first games that really dug into trying to go deeper with the narrative, especially with the story of, Garland going back in time and everything, which set up a lot of, future ideas for other villains later in the series that were invested in time travel with their plot. So it really did set a tone. Obviously this is the game that spawned a whole franchise, and while it didn't have a whole lot of the features that we love today, or even that most people started to love through the later 2D titles, it set a strong precedent. There's no complaints, right? I stacked up with the rest of the series. It's not the strongest, but there's nothing. I'm not going to say there's anything really bad with it, to be honest. 1 is just absolute B tier, in my opinion. Not an indictment at all, and there is nothing wrong with that, in my opinion. This takes us into Final Fantasy II. This one is not real high up, in my opinion. Now, I do recognize the things that it added to the series. It did start to kind of grow a little bit, give a little bit of a deeper narrative, and implement some of these new ideas, but not all of them worked, in my opinion. I wasn't a big fan of the leveling system in this one. Last time I played through it, leveling up the abilities only as you use seems like a good idea in practice, and I think later games got this better, whether it's the licensing system in 3 or the junction or the sphere grid. There's better systems for this later in the round. I don't think they got it right this time, and that's the risk and reward for 2, is that there was a lot that they tried to implement, but it didn't always execute. The story has a very anticlimactic feel to it. There's some things at the end I really did not like. Ultimately, it is one of my least favorites in the series. Now, that doesn't mean it's a terrible game. I think, bad Final Fantasy it's still Final Fantasy. But in relation to where these, titles are at right here, it's a D tier. 3, which is actually, in the earlier stages of the series, this is one of my favorites out of all the 2D titles. Whereas 2 implemented a lot of things that I don't think got done right, I think 3 is where they did get some of those liberties correct. There's some awesome stuff going on here. The funny thing about 3 is that, every Final Fantasy game, for the most part, has a good story, right? Some games, the story will absolutely offset some iffy mechanics. 3, the mechanics are probably my favorite part about this game. This is the first look into the licensing system that ended up being refined a little bit down the road, and I just think it's done really well front to back. I think 3 is a really fun game, and that gets us, it's the first A tier on this list. I love 3. It's a great time. Moving forward into 4, the first time I played 4, I didn't really appreciate or enjoy it as much. It has grown on me. The thing that I really do like, I mentioned this with 1, how Garland set up certain tropes for villains down the road, right? 4 does this same kind of thing with the puppet master trope. We see it in 8 and 9, and in some of the other titles as well, but mainly in those 2. It really brought in the element of the villain is not always who you think it's going to be, and it really implements more plot twists into the series. And for that, I really like 4. This is where the stories that started to get deeper really started to take off. Later on down the road, After Years also came out, which is very similar experience to 4, just kind of expanded on a few things. So I am going to put them together. Overall, 4 it's a good time. I put it similarly to 1 because it doesn't stand out, but it doesn't really do anything wrong. 5 is another one of the early titles that, really showed what the series can do. And it felt like the main focus, when you play it, the main focus of 5 is expanding upon the systems that 3 implemented. Job system that we saw earlier in 3 is just expanded upon exponential amount, right? X-Death is an incredible villain in my mind. So 5, very close to 3, because I think that 5 is just the expanded bigger version of 3, and it was done so really well. Now, going into the next stretch of the series, this is where I start to have some real fun, because a lot of these are going to be some of my favorite titles. I think, a lot of people would agree that this is the golden age of the series. So I'm going to be gushing here for a second, but these next few games are just masterpiece after masterpiece, and the reason that I love the Final Fantasy series so much. So let's get into it. 6 often gets overlooked by some of the younger crowd because, it's still a 2D title. And I remember when I was younger, the first games I had played were 8 and 9, and I was just like, at first, apprehensive to go back to it. And then you play it, and enthralling story in a Final Fantasy game, topped with, in my opinion, the strongest villain in the whole series. Kefka's the perfect villain in my mind. From his origin story of being a Magitech experiment gone wrong to just how ruthless he is. From beginning to end, you see how he treats the people beneath him, and just this power trip he has. It gets him all the way to becoming a godlike being, which isn't the only time we see it in Final Fantasy, but I think this is the strongest case. Kefka, on his own, could carry this game, but it's not just that. It's the story of all the protagonists. It's the battle system, which I think is just the most clean-cut Final Fantasy system there is. Some of the later games that I enjoy a little bit more took some risks, have some things that make them unique, whereas 6, in my opinion, is like the most clean JRPG turn-based experience you can get. Nothing is broken about it. It is just the quintessential experience. You mix that with the story, you mix that with, in my opinion, the second best boss battle, but the best final villain in a Final Fantasy series. It's easy to say 6 is S tier. 6 is S tier. It is my 4th favorite in the whole series, and it is a true masterpiece. This next part is where I lose some people. Now, when I talk about 7, people seem to get the impression that I don't like it. I am of the belief that other games around this time period are better and get overlooked because of, what 7 did for the franchise, for the genre even. I will never overlook that. I do think going back to it, not as strong as it is revered to be. There's still a lot of amazing things going on. This isn't an indictment on the title at all. There's just a few things I don't like. I'm not the biggest fan of the materia system. As amazing as Sephiroth was, he seems to be, lacking just that little bit that puts him over the edge of some of the other villains like Kefka. He's still a brutal villain. Again, my whole thing with 7 is I think it's a masterpiece. I just think there's better titles around this part in the series. It is still, by all means, an S tier game, one of the greatest games ever made. I just think that other titles deserve the love that it gets. So it sounds like I'm talking down on it. So let's just take a moment. 7 is an S tier game. 7 has an amazing story. I love Cloud. I love the rest of the cast of characters. Aerith's death scene is one of the most heartbreaking scenes in a video game. Sephiroth is still one of the strongest villains out there. Falls short for a few reasons. Like I said, the materia system I'm not a big fan of. I think that the final boss battle is underwhelming, but that final stage, it was meant to be cinematic, so it's cool. I'll give it that. It's a give or take. It's still a great game. It's a classic for a reason. We're entering territory of a hill that I am willing to die on. Final Fantasy VIII is my favorite video game of all time. I think it is one of the greatest games ever made, not without its faults. but it was the first Final Fantasy game I ever played. It was the first really heavy story game I ever played. It made me fall in love with the act of storytelling. It made me fall in love with turn-based games, with games that level up. We know, as you know, I didn't know it at the time, but as somebody on the spectrum, I've always been a fan of RPGs for the sake of leveling up and character development. And this was the first game that really tickled that itch for me. And it was just a magical experience I fell in love with. I love the story of 8. I think that there's some weird things, you know, the Amnesia storyline and time compression are a little convoluted. I will admit that. I will say there is a mod out there. I know this doesn't count for the main game, but for those of you who are bugged by those parts, there is a mod out there called Succession, which rewrites the story or rewrites the script. It makes some of those things make a lot more sense, and it made me fall in love with the game even more. It's kind of like headcanon for me at this point, but you can't really count that towards the main game. So I understand that there are some plot things, but just, I love the dynamics between the characters. Dickish as he can be, I love Squall. I've always kind of related to Squall, you know, throughout. There's certain scenes in the game, the flashback to him wondering where Alone was and saying that he's going to be fine. Like, still to this day, I bawl at that scene because of personal relations to that shit. I think that while Ultimecia is not as strong of a villain as Kefka, the boss fight, the final boss fight with Ultimecia is the greatest final boss in the whole series. All 4 stages insanely difficult for each for its own unique reason. And even then, you know, Ultimecia herself doesn't get a whole lot of screen time other than the fact that she's possessing other characters like Adia, and all those fights with Adia, insane. There is so much, you know, the junctioning system, it tears some people up, but the customization that it allows you, I personally love. It allows me to set up the characters in the game in the way that I want more than so many other titles up until, I'd say, 10 allow you to do. I think that 8 is an absolute masterpiece. It is my favorite game in the whole entire world, and it always will be. I get so emotional every time I play that game. I've beaten it so many times, it never gets old. You know, some of those mods that are out there make me fall in love even more with it, and the fact that, you know, it makes you look at the story in a whole new light. Even without that stuff, the core game itself, it is the top of the line here. We are still going in this golden age, though. There's still 2 more titles here, and 9, I think, is vastly underappreciated. There are some complaints about it, and I hate to be this guy, but I feel like a lot of the dislike from 9 comes from not understanding it, and I get that because that's exactly where I was at. I thought Necron came out of nowhere. I didn't really like it until I realized, like, oh no, this is literally death. The characters, my theory, and I've seen this theory floating around, is that the characters actually died in that final battle, and Necron is them fighting for their lives. You know, I don't know if that's actually been confirmed or something, but that's how I've always interpreted it, and I think that's fucking awesome. I think the possibility that Garland succeeded, and the fact that Zidane, you know, spoiler alert, by the way, Zidane becomes king at the end. Genius. It is such a tragic story that it only makes sense. The villain kind of slightly got what he wanted in the end. But even that aside, even the theorizing about the end aside, and 9 gives you this cute fantasy overtone story with characters that every single one of them is just ridden with existential dread, and just stories that are so just deep and painful. And I love 9 for that. A lot of the boss fights in 9 are incredibly memorable, and again, the story itself is beautiful. The soundtrack, while overplays on one motif a little bit, I mean, 8 kind of does that too. It's okay. 10 kind of does that too. I like it. Nobuo Uematsu is a genius. So, no complaints there at all. 9 is up there as well. I think Final Fantasy X has the best story. It has the most plot twists, the most heartbreak, and from a storytelling standpoint, from a technical standpoint, Final Fantasy has always done this thing where it world builds almost perfectly, but if you were to take one game into a masterclass of how do you make such a massive world so easily digestible, boom, Final Fantasy X. You learn something new with every area you go into. It is so enjoyable. You grow with the world, you grow with these characters, and that's just the story. The Sphere Grid is an incredible leveling system, absolutely amazing leveling system that allows you so much flexibility. I talked about the flexibility the junction system allows you. The Sphere Grid takes that to a whole new level, especially in the international and the remastered versions with the expert Sphere Grid. You can do whatever you want with your characters. You can flip them around to do whatever role you want. I think that is amazing. Boss fights in this game they're definitely up there with 8 and 9 as far as how memorable they are, and in some cases just how frustrating they are. Seymour Flux and Unalesca are two of the hardest bosses in the entire series, but the feeling of beating them after getting stuck on them, incredible. The endgame content, especially in the remastered version, the endgame content adds so much to the game. It takes a 30-40 hour game, 20 if you've played it enough, into a damn near 200 hour experience if you're trying to do a penance run. Chills the whole time I'm playing 10. It is my second favorite title in all of Final Fantasy. If it wasn't for my sentimental hold on 8, I almost would enjoy 10 as much as 8. I think 10 is like the perfect game, just like I think 8 is too. They are very close in ranking. And 10-2 is really your first mixed bag since Final Fantasy 2. There's some things it really does right. The battle system was, at the time, probably like the final stepping stone before what 12 and 13 gave us, where you still have the ATB. It's still turn-based. However, it is very fast-paced. It feels like it's a lot more free flow. If you've played it, you understand what I mean. The dress spheres in the classes, it feels like an homage to 3 and 5. Very customizable, very fun in that aspect. So, like, the battle system is really the highlight of 10-2. You get some fun boss fights in there. For me, for my own personal reasons, like going through each area, it's kind of cool. It's like a little bit of a checklist. I like that. I dig it. But the dialogue is just so hard to get through. It is so... The dialogue's so bad in 10-2. It's a very short experience, too. But still, there's some things that I have fun with. It's not like I'm going to, I'm never really going to go out of my way to be like, oh, I really, really want to play this. But sometimes I'm just like, yeah, let's play 10-2. Like, whatever. It is what it is. It's a C. It's a C. It's a C. There's some things it does right. But it's not awful. 11, I would feel wrong putting it in D tier on the merit that I never played 11 or 14. And so those are the only two titles I'm really going off of. Like, I'm going off of what I've read and what I've seen. I do know there's a lot of things with 11 that needed to be better. It was the first Final Fantasy MMO. So of course, like, it wasn't polished yet. Hell, even 14 when it first launched wasn't polished. I mean, that is just a redemption story like no other, but I digress. I would put it in D, but I haven't had my own experience with it like I have anything else that I would put in there. So it is going to be the bottom of C tier because, I could put it there and I could be totally wrong. I don't know. Like, it's really hard to rank this one because it's the one I'm the least familiar with. So I can't, you get what I'm saying, right? Going out there and saying, like, oh, it's god awful. Like, it could be. I don't know. So I'm just going to put it at the bottom of C tier because what I've seen and what I've heard, not a fan of, but I never experienced it myself. 12 grew on me. If we had ranked this when it came out, I would put 12 below 10 too. I'd put it in C tier. I was not stoked on 12 when it first came out, especially since Zodiac Age has come out. 12 does a lot good. It's a really good story, even though it's Star Wars, but it's a really good story. I love the licensing system. It is kind of like a dialed back sphere grid, but I like what it does. I love the Monster Hunter side quest, which was shown later in 50. Like, anytime there's a Monster Hunter side quest, I eat that shit up. Revenant Wings is, kind of a weird little expansion thing. It wasn't god awful, but like, it definitely wasn't for me. I basically tried it out once and went, because I didn't even know it was a thing when it first came out. Then way down the road, I tried it out, and I was like, that's a thing. Okay, cool, whatever. If the person who likes Final Fantasy 13 is watching this, I'm so sorry, but I'm about to lose you. Ding, ding, ding. Look, convoluted story, convoluted fighting system. There's a few things, you know what? I'll put 13-2 ahead of 13, just off the merit that 13-2 has 13-2 has your classic, like, Thanos, or Empire Strikes Back, like, villain wins moment. That gives it some points. Like, that's cool. There's some of the story stuff in 13 is better. 13-2 is better, but it's built off the back of it already such a convoluted story. It does. I've seen multiple videos on this, so I'm going to echo this point. It takes all of the things that 10 did when 10 didn't feel linear, right? 10 built the world beautifully. 13 just info dumps all that shit on you. And then it has this weird hybrid, not turn-based, but still kind of turn-based. Like, I don't know. I don't like the fighting system. It's messy, and I'm not a fan. I am not a fan. I think Lightning Returns is the worst entry. I couldn't get through it. I couldn't get through any of the games in 13, to be honest with you. I ended up watching a bunch of cutscene videos and watching a bunch of the boss fights after. I just had to put it down when I first tried it. I do not like 13. I know it's not an uncommon opinion, but I just viscerally do not like 13 at all. And then there's 14. For very similar reasons to 11, I don't know if I can put it in S tier because I have not experienced it, but I know how much love this game gets. I know how highly it is talked about. So when I put it here, no. There. When I put it there, I want you guys to know that this is based off everything I've watched on it. I've watched a lot of people stream this on Twitch and on YouTube. A lot of the things I've read about the game and just the praise I have seen. This is not from my experience, but this is just my understanding. This is one of the 2 entries on here that is just from my understanding of how people feel about them. Maybe eventually I'll try it because it looks amazing, but I can't put this in S tier just like I can't put 11 in D tier. Sound fair? 15 I lose a few people on, and I need to preface this with something that I didn't really say as much in my last video. Well, I did, but the music drowned me out. But I digress. I understand that 15 is not going to be everyone's favorite game. There are some things that 15 does right. I love Arden as a villain. I think he is just your pretentious, like, Joffrey type of I fucking hate you type of villain. I love that. As the game goes on, Arden becomes more and more hateable, and he's done really well. Battle system is fun. I do think they could have refined it to feel a little bit more Final Fantasy-like, or at least a little bit more Kingdom Hearts-like if they're trying to go for that route. But, I still had fun with it. It's short. The main quest is way too short for a Final Fantasy game. I will give it that. Way too short. 15 has one thing that a lot of the titles don't have until you get to the ending portion of their games. And that is from front to back. You can do as many side quests as you want. You can roam and you can explore the world as much as you want. Again, I mentioned earlier about how I love RPGs, being autistic, how I love just like the developmental part. That is like my thing that makes my brain tick, right? Another one of those is exploration. So whereas I know 15, like when I'm playing through the story, I know 15 should be like a B tier game, maybe C. And all of the side quests come in, the monster hunting, the dungeon crawling, the just adventuring. And all of that, in my opinion, is enough to take it up to an A tier. Like, Final Fantasy 15 side quests is an S to me. The rest of the game is a C, right? That equals it out to where when I did my first A tier, I had it at the front. I've revisited 3 and 5 recently, but 15 side quests just tickle my brain in a way that not a lot of games do. That in itself puts 15 in A tier for me. Fully understanding that it has a lot of, shortcomings for a Final Fantasy game. There it is. It's complete. It's re-uploaded. It's fixed. You can hear me now. A little bit more articulated in my takes this time, right? But yeah, this is my tier list. And I did this as close, and like this is in order too, if you were to look at it. From bottom to top, Lightning Returns, 13, 13, 2, 2, 11, this is all in order, right? So, take a look at this. Pause it if you need to. Let me know in the comments if you agree or you disagree and why not. I have no issues if you disagree because at the end of the day, this is an opinion-based list. So, let's have some conversations. Let's have some discourse about it. If you want more Final Fantasy content, let me know. If you just want more tier lists about random shit, let me know. Like, I'm so new to all of this. Any sort of feedback helps. So, I appreciate you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was more enjoyable this time around. And until next time, I will see you later.